Former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro has been found guilty of attempting to overturn the results of the country's 2022 election, with the help of a conspiracy that, according to the prosecutor, included plans to assassinate the elected president in an attempt to hold on to power. 4 out of 5 judges of Brazil's Supreme Court voted to find Bolsonaro guilty on all 5 counts in the landmark case and sentenced him to 27 years and 3 months in prison. This is probably the first case in modern history when a former president is sent to prison for such a long term for attempting a coup to seize power in his own country. My name is Alexis Pecci. Today is September 12th on the calendar, and in this episode we will discuss the story of Jair Bolsonaro and how the former president of Brazil has now been sent to prison for 27 years. But before we begin, I want to remind you that every day on this YouTube channel, several news analysis stories from around the world are released. So that you stay up to date with absolutely all the news, I recommend subscribing to this YouTube channel and ask you to like this episode. So, today, September 12, former president of Brazil Jair Bolsonaro was found guilty of preparing a coup d'etat, participating in an armed criminal organization, and attempting to forcibly overturn the democratic order in Brazil, committing violent acts against government institutions and causing damage to protected public property. During the storming of government buildings by his supporters on January 8, 2020, this is the general set of charges against Bolsonaro, for which he was found guilty. By the way, some commentators are already hinting that Donald Trump made a similar, albeit smaller in scale, attempt to seize power on January 6, 2021. And according to Brazilian prosecutors, part of the conspiracy to stage a coup included a plan to potentially use explosives, firearms, or poison for murder. The leftist president Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, his vice president Geraldo Alckmin, and Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes, who oversaw the trial of Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro and the other defendants, of course, denied their guilt during the trial. The evidence against Bolsonaro mainly concerned how he tried to hold on to power after losing the 2022 presidential election to Lula da Silva. The Brazilian Federal Police stated that Bolsonaro was fully aware of the plan to overturn the election results. There was pressure put on the country's military to intervene, and even the creation of a parallel crisis management administration to run the government. In simple terms, Bolsonaro tried to bribe the army and even create a parallel one. Brazilian prosecutors claim that the coup plot began back in 2021, with attempts to undermine public trust in the electoral system. After Bolsonaro's defeat in the 2022 elections, according to prosecutors, the accused tried to overturn the results of those elections. Brazilian prosecutors claimed that the plot began in 2021 with attempts to undermine public trust in the electoral system. All the charges, once again, are very similar to the accusations against Donald Trump regarding the events of January 2021 when his supporters stormed the Capitol. And a little later, you will understand why I connected the American president to this story. Moraes, who was the first judge to deliver a guilty verdict against Bolsonaro and his team, stated that the defendants, quote, committed all the criminal offenses charged by the Prosecutor General's office. Judges Flavio Dino, Carmen Lucia, and Christian Zanin also voted to find Bolsonaro guilty, but one Supreme Court judge still did not support the charges, which leaves Bolsonaro with a loophole for appeal. Nevertheless, according to the verdict, 70-year-old Bolsonaro faces spending the rest of his life in prison. In addition, he is deprived of the right to participate in elections for 8 years. Defense lawyers can still file appeals. But once these options are exhausted, the decision will become final, and any prison sentences may be enforced. But let me remind you, that's more than 27 years in prison. Of course, there were also political consequences, since Bolsonaro also has his own electoral base. The trial, which took place on the eve of the 2026 general elections, divided Brazil. Last weekend, on this country's Independence Day, thousands of Bolsonaro supporters took to the streets protesting against the trial. Bolsonaro's eldest son, Flávio Bolsonaro, who is a senator of Brazil, criticized the outcome of the elections and lashed out at Judge Moraes. Quote, "Under the pretext of defending democracy, its foundations were destroyed in order to convict an innocent man who did not dare to bow before the dictator named Alexandre de Moraes." Quite expected. Bolsonaro himself has long insisted that the trial is a political witch hunt. And now for the most interesting part, I didn't mention Donald Trump earlier in this episode for nothing. Bolsonaro's opinion that this is a political witch hunt is shared by one of his biggest political allies. United States President Donald Trump, who imposed a 50% tariff on Brazilian goods, threatened to do so if the country did not stop the legal proceedings against Bolsonaro. Once again, Trump imposed tariffs against Brazil over the trial of the former president. His administration also imposed sanctions against Judge Moraes herself for what it considers serious human rights violations, and announced visa restrictions for him and other court officials. Regarding the trial of Bolsonaro, Trump did not say whether he would impose new sanctions when journalists asked him about the guilty verdict, but he expressed shock at the outcome of the trial. Quote, 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 quote. And so, supporters of Bolsonaro and some representatives of right-wing forces in Brazil welcome Trump's interest in this case. However, the current administration in Brazil, like many other representatives of this Latin American country, considers this to be United States interference in its affairs. Judge Luis Fux voted to acquit the former president on all charges. He was the only one. He claims that what happened is not a coup because Lula da Silva was ultimately not overthrown, therefore the attempted coup can simply be forgotten. He also stated that the court does not have jurisdiction to consider this case, and in his opinion, the court's decision should be overturned. So the logic of this judge is basically, listen, the president wasn't overthrown, he wasn't killed, so what's the crime? Well, if he had been overthrown, then we could talk about it. But since it didn't happen, let's just forget about it. But here I want to point out an interesting trend in Latin America in general. Bolsonaro has essentially joined a growing list of Latin American leaders who have been convicted of crimes in recent years. Last month, former Colombian President Álvaro Uribe was sentenced to 12 years of house arrest after being found guilty of procedural fraud and witness tampering. In 2022, former Argentine leader Cristina Fernández de Kirchner was convicted of corruption related to government contract work. In 2017, current Brazilian President Lula da Silva was found guilty of corruption and money laundering and spent more than a year in prison before his sentence was overturned. Now he is president. Bolsonaro is being sent to jail. In general, this is already becoming a certain trend. But friends, I'll leave it at that for now. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this video. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.